Hello, my citizen legislators. Welcome back to Topless Government, the show that's a cross between Schoolhouse Rock and Civics for the Masses. I want to make this show relatable and fun for everyone on why you should know how your government works. Remember, knowledge is power. So we're going to get this party started. I'm the host, Crystal Ellerby. And y'all know what? Y'all know this already. I live, I breathe, I eat, I sleep politics. And today, I'm going to talk about something that's a little bit somber, but it got me to thinking because a really good friend of mine, hat tip to Marsha Burton, who lives in Nashville, Tennessee. She is a presidential, historian, buff, amateur buff. And we got to talking when everybody found out that former President Jimmy Carter decided to just do hospice at home. Now, before any of y'all say anything, oh, he's 98 years old, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, he is. But you know what? It just got me to thinking about what is the protocol for presidential funerals and burials? What is it? Um, I've lived, I'm a native Washingtonian. I was born in Washington, D.C. I lived out in Prince George's County and Charles County, but I'm a native Washingtonian. And growing up, I got to tell you, when former presidents died, we got the day off. I mean, I remember Lyndon B. Johnson. I remember Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan. And these are when I was an adult. But I got to tell you, I mean, it's very interesting to me to just see this. I mean, even the late Senator Edward Kennedy, you know, and even recently, like George H.W. Bush, the late Representative Don Young from Alaska, they all lied in state in the U.S. Capitol. But I just really wanted to just talk about this because, you know, Jimmy Carter announced that he was entering, hospice care at home with his family, and I totally respect it. I do. I totally respect it. Um, I was 11 years old when Jimmy Carter was elected president of the United States, and during his presidency, the country was going through an energy crisis, inflation, as well as Americans being held hostage in Iran. I mean, he went through a lot. I mean, and at the time, a lot of people thought his presidency was a failure. But you know what? In actuality, hindsight is 2020, like everybody say. He had it tough, but he handled the domestic and foreign crisis, the best to his ability. He wasn't a professional politician. I mean, he was governor of Georgia, but he still is. He's a godly man. He's a religious man. And, like I said earlier, a dear friend and former colleague of mine, Marsha Burton, she reached out to me after the announcement. And again, it just got me to thinking, what starts the process of state funerals for a former president? All right, I just want to discuss presidential funerals and burials. I know it's somber, and today is the Lord's Day, but let's do this because I want to educate y'all. And I got to honestly tell you, I learned a lot. I really, really did. I learned a lot. I don't want to make this episode sound morbid, but again, throughout my life, I've watched and I've paid tribute to former presidents that have died. And like I said earlier, living in the DMV, we got the day off. And so now let's talk about the process. So get this, you know, um, there are just so many things that goes into play when it comes to presidential funerals and burials. And in my show notes, I do have some links to several different articles, and actually there's some other things in here from the White House Historical um, Association, and some other things about modern morning observations at the White House, and some articles and some background on the life and career of James Carter. But again, I'm like, I just want to go into specifically, where do we start? Like, seriously. So there is a CRS report that's dated December 20th, 2019. And it's just a fact sheet on, what do you do? It's, it's a brief overview, provides a brief overview of past practices. And it just talks about when a president dies, there's a number of activities and events that are set into motion. And the vast majority of these activities and events are governed by custom rather than statute, and may be influenced by the wishes of the deceased president's family. So let's go into official actions and responsibility. Now, typically, the incumbent president issues a presidential proclamation that serves as an official announcement of the death of a former president. Now, in recent decades, these proclamations have, in accordance with federal law, directed that the U.S. flag should be flown at half-staff for 30 days. The proclamations have also given specific guidance regarding where the flag should be flown at half-staff. In the proclamation announcing the death of Ronald Reagan, President George W. Bush issued the following directive. The federal flag shall be flown at the White House and on all buildings, grounds, and naval vessels of the United States for a period of 30 days from the day of his death. I also direct that for the same length of time, the representatives of the United States in foreign countries shall make similar arrangements for the display of the flag at half-staff over their embassies, legations, and other facilities abroad, including all military facilities and stations. Now, I can tell you, I was here for President Ronald Reagan's funeral, and I was working on Capitol Hill. And at the time, I was working for the congressman that represented the 2nd Congressional District of Louisiana, Congressman David Vitter. He's a Republican. And I will never forget this. The airspace of the U.S. Capitol, you're not supposed to fly over it. So everybody was standing outside they were queuing outside to get in line so they could see, the casket in the U.S. Capitol. Reagan lied in state. So everybody was outside. I mean, we had already saw his cortege when they brought his body up, and we actually watched that. That was like the day before. Anyway, so we're all, our office was in Cannon House Office Building. And lo and behold, guess what? We had the alert that we had to leave the building because there was an aircraft that flew over the airspace of the U.S. Capitol. And all hell broke loose. Capitol Hill police were telling us that, we just had to keep running. And I was with 2 interns. And I just got to the point, it's like, I'm not running no more. I was like, let's just go to Tortilla Coast and grab a margarita. And then we'll just make our way back to the office. But like literally everybody that was standing in line, I mean, it was complete and utter chaos. But I have to tell you, as a staffer, we stood in line, but we stood in line inside the Capitol. And I actually got to see Reagan's, body lie in state. And it was you know, it was an honor to be able to do that, and specifically as being, congressional staffer at the time. But I gotta tell you, it was very eerie because we had to walk up the stairs to the rotunda where he was lying in state. And I gotta tell you, the air changed when we moved upstairs. So let's talk about what happens that triggers all that. Well, according to the CRS report, other responsibilities are delegated to the Commanding General, Military District of Washington, U.S. Army. They are the ones that are responsible for state funeral arrangements, as described in detail in the Army pamphlet entitled State, Official, and Special Military Funerals. This document also lists those entitled to a state funeral, including the current president, ex-president, president-elect, and any other person specifically designated by the current president. Now, let me read an excerpt from this pamphlet on the key responsibilities and the delegation that follows. So here are the responsibilities. The president notifies Congress that he has directed that a state funeral be conducted. The Congress, who has sole authority for the use of the U.S. Capitol, makes the rotunda available for the state ceremony through its own procedures. The Secretary of Defense is the designated representative of the President of the United States. The Secretary of the Army is the designated representative of the Secretary of the Defense for the purpose of making all arrangements for state funerals in Washington, D.C. This includes participation of all armed forces and coordination with the State Department for participation of all branches of government and the diplomatic corps. The Commanding General, Military District of Washington, U.S. Army, as the designated representative of the Secretary of the Army, will make all ceremonial arrangements for the state funerals in Washington, D.C., and will be responsible for the planning and arranging of state funerals throughout the continental United States. Now, there are many variations and combinations of ceremonies and traditional events and activities honoring the former president that are possible. And I'm just going to recite a few of those possibilities, and it includes the following. So there's 3 possibilities and 3 combinations. A former president's remains may lie in repose for 1 day and then be removed to the Capitol Rotunda to lie in state, during which a funeral ceremony and a public viewing may occur. A former president, as former commander-in-chief, is entitled to burial and ceremony in the Arlington National Cemetery. If, however, the former president is to be buried outside of Washington, D.C., honors may be rendered at a train station, terminal, or airport that serves as point of departure for the remains. Other honors that may be rendered during ceremonies include musical honors, gun and cannon salutes, and a U.S. Air Force coordinated flyover. Now, let's talk about the most recent funeral of a former president. Now, most recently, back in 2018, President George H.W. Bush, he died on November 30th, 2018. And former President Donald Trump announced the death and issued a proclamation that U.S. flags on all federal facilities be flown at half staff for 30 days. The proclamation also appointed December 5th, 2018 as a national day of mourning throughout the United States. On December 1st, 2018, former President Trump also issued Executive Order 13852, which directed the closing of federal offices and agencies on the National Day of Mourning. Former President Bush then lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda from December 3rd to December 5th, with subsequent services on December 5th at Washington National Cathedral. Services for former president were also conducted on December 6th in Houston, Texas, with interment following at the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum. So, as you can see, this is how it's done. Now, I want to relay some stories about presidential funerals and burials, and even those that were not presidents, because I want to talk about former Associate Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, when she died, it was during COVID. It was at the height of the pandemic. And I live on Capitol Hill, and I wanted to pay my respects to her because she did a lot for women in this country. And I just wanted to honor her memory. And so I stood in line and I had my mask on, my not today COVID mask on. And she lay in state in front of the portico of the U.S. Supreme Court, which is across the street from the U.S. Capitol. I mean, I got to tell you, I'm not going to lie. I cried like a baby. I did. I cried like a baby because I knew that that was the beginning of the end for us when it came to reproductive rights. But y'all know my feelings about abortion. In my first episode of my first season that I talked about the overturning of Roe v. Wade. There was and then during the height of the pandemic, Congressman John Lewis, I really wanted to go see him lie in state, and it was in the portico of the U.S. Capitol building. But I just didn't have the strength to do it. I remember seeing him on Capitol Hill. I would just go weak at the knees because he had such a presence, and I just would nod. I would just say, "Hi, Congressman Lewis," and I would nod, and he would say hello, and I would just keep on walking out of respect. But, these are the types of, things that we do for politicians and for those that, the Supreme Court. There were members of the Supreme Court. And I got to tell you, it always amazes me living in DC all my life. I still have to pinch myself when it comes to funerals and burials of presidents, of former presidents, of other politicians, statesmen, stateswomen. It just, I don't know. I mean, it's just like, you're like, wow, this is happening. And I live in the city where I get to go see someone that I grew up watching lie in state in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. And it just, I don't know. It's surreal. It's always been surreal for me. But I wanted to take the opportunity to just, walk you through what the procedure is. And, at that point, when former President James Jimmy Earl Carter goes home, that's when President Biden will put the declaration out, and there will be a national day of mourning, and, federal government will close. And I heard that President Jimmy Carter has asked President Biden to do his eulogy, to give his eulogy. And I think that's very, very special. I mean, y'all remember when John McCain died, and, they had his funeral at the Washington National Cathedral. He lay in state in the rotunda. Same thing with Senator Bob Dole. He was a World War II vet. He was in the Senate for quite a long time. He was Senate Majority Leader. He was Minority Leader. He was Minority Whip at some point. But again, I'm like, I was able to see him lie in state as well. But again, I will never forget when I saw Ronald Reagan lie in state, because that was just totally and utterly, unbelievable. And it's just, I don't know. Like I said, it was a privilege, because at the time I was a public servant. I was working for a member of the House of Representatives. Um, I just said, it's something that we all witnessed. I mean, look, like Marvin Gaye's song, Trouble Man. There are three things for sure: taxes, death, and trouble. And that's God's truth. Taxes, death, and trouble. We all got to experience those three things at some point in our lives. We do. And I just thought that educating you about the protocols and the process of presidential funerals and how it starts. I mean, I could go back to when I read A Team of Rivals by Ron Chernow about Abraham Lincoln. I mean, remember when he was assassinated? And I think it was April 5th, 1865. I mean, just remember what they did. I mean, and how, it was all planned and put together, and the train ride back, to Illinois. I mean, John F. Kennedy and what, his widow, Jacqueline Kennedy, what she did. I mean, she put together, she planned that his funeral and the burial in Arlington Cemetery. I mean, she was the one that put together, how he was going to be interred. I mean, I could go on and on, but this is a bit of a morbid, somber subject. But again, like I said earlier, my friend Marsha Burton, she and I got to talking, and that is what led me to make the decision to do an episode on presidential funerals and burials. And I hope that you found it educational. I do have a lot of articles in the show notes on Jimmy Carter and his bio, and, the White House Historical Association. I have a link to, a presidential funeral and the modern mourning observations at the White House. And then also there's the official homepage for U.S. state funerals. It's, Army dot mil. I mean, you know what? I mean, it's just, again, I just wanted to just show you what this is. And it's, I'm just a loss for words. But I would tell you, I would check out the White House Historical Association, because they do have a really good website on presidential and state funerals. I mean, they start with William Henry Harrison, who died while in office. I mean, he wasn't in office that long. He was actually the first president to die while in office, and his funeral had no precedent. So just think about, how they had to scramble and put that all together. I mean, and let's talk about another funeral, Zachary Taylor. He died July 13th, 1850, 4 days after President Tyler's unexpected passing on July 9th, 1850. So I'm sorry. So he died on July 9th, and his funeral was July 13th, and it was unexpected. I mean, come on. I mean, okay, Abraham Lincoln. So, yeah, April 19th through May 4th, 1865. 4 days after President Lincoln's death on April 15th, 1855. I apologize. I misspoke when I mentioned Abraham Lincoln. So his funeral took place in the East Room of the White House. 600 mourners attended the service, including President Andrew Johnson and General Ulysses S. Grant. First Lady Mary Lincoln was too grief-stricken to appear. The White House and the U.S. Capitol were dressed in black. There were gun salutes, church bells tolled, and the country observed a day of mourning. Tens of thousands of spectators gathered to watch the mile-long procession to the Capitol that followed, which included the president's hearse, military escorts, members of the administration, and some of Lincoln's family. Now, Lincoln's body lay in state at the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, the first president to receive this honor, until April 21st, when his remains, along with those of his deceased son, Willie, departed the city aboard a funeral train outfitted in black. A hastily constructed wooden bear was made to hold Lincoln's casket, earning the nickname the Lincoln, I can't even, Calfew. Massive crowds lined the route, earning, look, the train stopped in Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Buffalo, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Chicago, and several others before finally reaching Springfield, Illinois on May 3rd. His remains were placed on view in the old state capitol. The next day, the president's remains were buried at Oak Ridge Cemetery. Now, James A. Garfield, September 21st through the 26th, 1881. President Garfield, he passed away in Elberon, New Jersey on September 19th, 1881. I mean, yeah. This time around, the funeral wasn't in the East Room. The funeral service took place on the afternoon of September 23rd. First Lady Lucretia Garfield did not attend. Instead, the rotunda was empty earlier in the day to give her privacy to say goodbye. Now, William McKinley, September 17th to the 19th, 1901. President McKinley succumbed to his gunshot wounds on September 14th, 1901. Excuse me, while in Buffalo, New York. His body returned to the nation's capital by train 2 days later, where it was escorted to the White House by cavalry squadron. McKinley's flag-draped casket lie in the East Room overnight, surrounded by floral decorations and tributes. In 1893, U.S. Code dictated that, quote, no building owned or used for public purposes by the government of the United States shall be draped in mourning, end quote. As a result, the White House was not draped in black mourning decor, as was common in the past. On September 17th, McKinley's cortege proceeded to the U.S. Capitol, where the funeral service took place. His remains lie in state for the rest of the day before being escorted to a waiting train, which departed that evening. William G. Harding, August 7th through the 10th, 1923. On August 2nd, 1923, while on tour of the Western United States, President Harding died unexpectedly in San Francisco. In his room at the Palace Hotel, a brief service was held, attended by First Lady Florence Harding and other members of his travel party. Harding's casket was conveyed back to the Capitol by train, guarded by Secret Service members of the armed forces. Oh, okay. Franklin D. Roosevelt, April 14th to the 15th, 1945. Now, everybody knows this. President Roosevelt passed away at Warm Springs, Georgia on April 12th, 1945. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt flew by plane to Warm Springs that night after visiting with President Harry Truman. First Lady Bess Truman and their daughter Margaret The next day, FDR's flagged draped casket began their journey back to Washington, D.C. aboard a train. Upon arrival in Washington, D.C., President Harry S. Truman and members of the cabinet met the train. A military caisson transported Roosevelt's remains to the White House, accompanied by members of the U.S. military, the Marine Band, and Roosevelt's family. Roosevelt's casket was placed in the East Room, which was decorated with flowers for the funeral service. Friends, family, and staff paid their respects, with crowds gathered in Lafayette Park, hoping to catch a glimpse. Because of the ongoing war, President Roosevelt did not lie in state at the U.S. Capitol, unlike his predecessors. Instead, the ceremony surrounding his passing was much smaller. Prior to his passing, Roosevelt had communicated some of his last wishes, one of which was to be buried in the Rose Garden at Hyde Park, the Roosevelt family home. As a result, a funeral train conveyed Roosevelt's body to Hyde Park after his White House viewing. On April 15th, President Roosevelt was buried in a ceremony that included a 21-gun salute and a P-47 flyover. Okay, John F. Kennedy, November 23rd through 25th, 1963. Infamous day, November 22nd, 1963. President Kennedy was assassinated while campaigning in Dallas, Texas. His body was conveyed back to Andrews Air Force Base aboard Air Force One. First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy asked White House Chief Usher J.B. West to research precedents and model her husband's state funeral after the ceremonies used for President Abraham Lincoln. On November 23rd, Kennedy's flag-draped casket was placed in the East Room of the White House by military honor guard. President Lyndon B. Johnson declared it a national day of mourning. The house was outfitted with mourning crepe for the occasion, and mourners stood vigil in the rain outside the White House gates. Now, President Kennedy's casket was taken to the Capitol Rotunda, and over 250,000 people passed through to pay their respects. His casket was placed atop the Lincoln Café, which had been used most of the line in state services in the Rotunda. The next morning, a funeral procession moved from the U.S. Capitol down Pennsylvania Avenue, passed by the White House, and then on to St. Matthew's Cathedral for a pontifical requiem mass. And then later that day, the president's casket was conveyed to Arlington Cemetery for the burial. At the service, there was an Air Force and a Navy flyover, including Air Force One, and Mrs. Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, and Robert F. Kennedy lit the eternal flame at the president's gravesite. There are many others, former presidents: Herbert Hoover, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Harry S. Truman, Lyndon B. Johnson, who died January 22nd, 1973. Richard M. Nixon, he died April 22nd, 1994. His funeral was April 27th, 1994. Ronald Reagan, he died June 5th, 2004. His funeral was June 11th, and I remember this because I stood in line. And then Gerald Ford, he died December 26th, 2006, but his funeral wasn't until January 2nd, 2007. And then George H.W. Bush, he died November 30th, 2018. His funeral ceremonies and burial December 5th through December 6th of 2018. So that's about it. I mean, this is all the information from the White House Historical Association's website on presidential and state funerals. I hope that this was educational and informative for you. And I thank you so much for watching, tuning in. This is Crystal Ellerby, the host of Topless Government. Thank you and have a good day.